Thank you all so much for being here. Thank you for inviting me. And I have to say, I'm listed as the keynote speaker, but I think that the tremendous woman who preceded me was really the keynote speaker. I mean, her story is incredibly inspiring. I sort of came here, I think, in a quiet way to sort of justify my job, which is writing about fashion. And it made me think about my first interview suit, which was a gift from my mother. I really was not particularly interested in fashion, and my mother, I thought, had very good taste, so I figured she would pick out something just fine and it would be appropriate. It was my senior year in college, and I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do, so I was doing interviews, figuring maybe something interesting would come along. The suit that she sent me was pale yellow. The jacket was double-breasted, and the skirt had pleats. I thought it was pretty nice, frankly. And I remember distinctly the day that I walked into the Career Center for that first interview, and a friend was standing there, and she was also wearing her interview suit, and it was navy. And she looked at mine, and she said, "Is that your interview suit?" And I was like, "Yeah." And she said, "But it's yellow." Now, I'm not sure what really sparked the response that I gave her because, I didn't really have very strong opinions about what constituted personal style. So I think my reply was a little bit brazen, but also defensive. And I said to her, well, if someone isn't going to hire me because my suit is yellow, I wouldn't want to work for them anyway. Now, there were a lot of reasons why an employer would not have wanted to hire me at that point. Namely, number one being I had no experience. But I do think that in hindsight, it was the moment when I realized that not only were clothes something that reflected who we are and how we'd like to be perceived, but they also reflected the relationship that we have with other people, particularly in the professional environment. It was the first time that I really understood that clothing in some way was also a bit of a guide. It was a personal expression, and it was a little clue about where it was that I might fit in the professional world. And I realized that there was not going to be a job for me that didn't allow for just at least a little bit of creativity. Over the years, when I'd write about the runways or some designer collection, or a public figure's attire, I would inevitably receive an email or a letter from a reader who wanted to know why I was wasting his or her time by writing about something as frivolous as fashion. I would bite my tongue, and I would not say, if you're so bored, why don't you read something else? No, because we need all of our readers in journalism. Instead, I would think back to that moment in college, and I would think about all the college students who were suited up to impress their employers. I would remind them that brides would not agonize over a single wedding dress, and we would not obsess about a Kate Middleton's dress if clothes did not matter. We wouldn't pull navy suits and black dresses from our closet when we went to pay our respects to the recently departed. And there would not be something called the interview suit, a garment that has withstood casual Fridays, dot-com slackers, and the flip-flop mentality of interns. God bless the interns. The fashion historian Anne Hollander once told me that the suit was a triumph of civilization. She exaggerated only slightly. Nothing else so unequivocally makes a statement about power, professionalism, and aptitude. It's fashion's ultimate shorthand. If ever there was an example of the power of a suit, look no further than Secretary of State and former Senator and presidential candidate Hillary Clinton. She has joked about the number of pantsuits that she wore during the presidential campaign, calling it the sisterhood of the traveling pantsuits. And before that, when she ran for the Senate, she relied on a handful of black pantsuits. The media, myself included, apologies to Secretary of State Clinton, gave outsized attention to those suits. But in part, it was because she'd created a perfect uniform of power for herself where one didn't exist. The black pantsuit made her attire a non-issue. She'd found a kind of professional camouflage so that only her words mattered. As a presidential candidate, she shifted to a truckload of brightly colored suits that at once evoked professionalism and femininity, and I'm sure they made dressing on the fly a lot easier. We all grapple with attire in some way, whether it is a man who's decided to live as a Peter Pan and wear sneakers and t-shirts for the rest of his life, or a woman who has declared herself immune to fashion and relies on a uniform of dirndl skirts and crewneck sweaters. We all yearn to control how we're perceived. We know that fashion matters because we care so deeply about what the First Lady wears. We are intrigued in part because we perhaps imagine what we might wear if we were in her circumstances. And I think about 300 million people all imagine that they would do it better. We care because she represents us on the world stage, and we want to be perceived as sophisticated and warm, smart and capable. And so we constantly assess her wardrobe. And I actually think that ultimately what most intrigues the population is that she seems to be dressing for herself and not for us. How dare she? Fashion matters because it brings us pleasure. It makes us feel good about ourselves, and when we do, we are more self-assured and more confident. We are at our best. At their best, fashion designers have created extraordinary garments that need no more justification than their exquisite beauty. Just looking at them puts a smile on your face. Some years ago, I was in Milan, and I went to a Dolce & Gabbana show. Before the show, the designers gave us a little preview, and they spent probably 20 minutes explaining how practical this collection was, how it was specifically for the global businesswoman who was jetting from one country to another and really needed a professional wardrobe that was flexible and that didn't wrinkle and that was just so powerful. So when I saw it on the runway, I thought to myself, this is quite possibly the most impractical collection I've ever seen in my entire life. But the clothes were stunning. And when I wrote about them, I said that sometimes the fashion industry spends so much time trying to equate what it does with the more banal aspects of life that they do themselves a disservice, that designers do themselves a disservice. Sometimes there's no need to legitimize beauty or the pleasure that we can take from it. But what most fascinates me about fashion is it as a form of communication, because it camouflages insecurities and it helps us swagger. And don't we all need to swagger just at least once a week? If fashion didn't matter, parents wouldn't become infuriated when their young daughters want to dress like Lindsay Lohan on her way to court. Blind dates would be a little less torturous. Prom night would not be the rite of passage that it is. And men wouldn't have transformed Dockers into a gazillion-dollar brand. If fashion didn't matter, Project Runway wouldn't be a hit of a television show, and rock stars would be a lot more boring. And a whole generation of young men would not have walked around with their jeans falling off their rear end in a subversive declaration of power. Fashion plays an outsized role in shaping our perceptions. And while I am very sensitive to the concern that focusing so much on it can be distracting or superficial, I also argue that if a person can be summed up solely by their attire, then they weren't very interesting to begin with. At its best, fashion helps us to fill in the details. It clarifies and emphasizes our point. At its worst, it muddles and obscures and detracts from our verbal eloquence. Fashion is a continuous social conversation. It can be a silent show of respect, a quiet assertion of power. It is both armor and security. It is not the substance of a resume, but it is the dazzling sheen. And it's the realities and the fantasies of a community of individuals told in an instant. Thank you so much.